Good morning. Today's Numbers Day, and welcome to the Workers by the Numbers blogcast presented by the Power at Work blog. I'm Seth Harris. I'm a senior fellow at Northeastern University's Burns Center for Social Change, and we're going to talk about the latest jobs, unemployment, and wages numbers that were released just 15 minutes ago by the Bureau of Labor Statistics at the Labor Department. Joining me in analyzing these numbers are two of the very best in the business, really expert labor economists who spend a lot of time digging through these numbers. First is my Northeastern University colleague, professor of public policy, urban affairs, and economics, and also the research director for the Dukakis Center at Northeastern University, Alicia Modestino. Good morning, Alicia.
Good morning, Seth. It's my favorite day of the month.
And also with us is senior researcher at the W.E. Upjohn Institute and a former White House senior economist, late of the University of Minnesota Economics Department, Aaron Sojourner. Good morning, Aaron.
Thanks, Seth. Great to be here.
Great to have you. So let's get right to it. Here are the headline numbers from BLS's January Employment Situation Report. The unemployment rate is 3.4%. The number of jobs created is an eye-popping, surprising 517,000. That is a huge increase from the last several months of job increases, and also a big jump from the average number for all of 2022. Wages increased 10 cents per hour. Average hourly earnings increased 10 cents. That's a 0.3% increase in wages, about what was expected and also about what we saw last month. We saw a very important story that hopefully we'll talk about is labor force participation, which is the percentage of people who are either working or actively looking for work increased, as did the percentage of people in the population who are working. Both very important numbers, and that's one of the things that makes the unemployment number going down surprising, because usually when labor force participation goes up, it makes it harder for the unemployment rate to go down. With respect to industries, a huge amount of job growth in the leisure and hospitality industry, 128,000, healthcare industry up 58,000, construction industry up 25,000, 30,000 for the retail industry, 23,000 for transportation. Government, a big increase, but a lot of that was the University of California graduate workers strike. And those strikers going back to work meant that the number of jobs created went up just because of the way we count strikers in our society. And also the professional and business services up 82,000. And I'm told that we have our friend Bill Spriggs has just been able to join us. So Lexi, why don't you add him in and he'll join into the conversation. So while we're waiting for Bill to join us, Alicia, let's start with you. Is this report good for workers, bad for workers, or is it a mixed bag for workers?
Well, by what we can see right now, it looks very good for workers. You don't really know how much of that 517 is possibly due to revisions, moving the jobs count upward. But, even if you took 100, 200,000 of those jobs due to revisions, it's still a very good number and beating most expectations. I think one thing that's really interesting is people had not been expecting such a big number, in part because of the headline layoffs that we've been seeing in tech, in Google and other places, FedEx. But, those layoffs are pretty well explainable, right? They're pandemic trends. We all stayed home. We bought a lot of stuff. We bought a lot of tech. We Zoomed a lot. And so, really that comes from overhiring during the pandemic and sort of correcting that overhiring. And so that turned out to not be a leading indicator for what's going on in the labor market, because really these gains were very widespread and even, reached a point where we're seeing some of the differences between groups that are narrowing, right? So we see the gap in the unemployment rate between Blacks and whites much more narrow now in January 2023 than in January 2020. So I'd say, this is a very good jobs report and unexpectedly good.
Aaron, what do you think? Good for workers, bad for workers, or a mixed bag?
Yeah, this is on its face very good for workers. It's a very strong report of job creation, new job earnings opportunities, people coming off the sidelines and finding jobs. There's a little bit of that. So Yeah, I mean, this number is, we've been seeing job growth declining and decelerating over the last, uh, 6 months, 8 months, and this number is way out of line. So I'm a little bit suspicious of it. And there were a lot of methodological adjustments put in. It's this month, a whole series of them actually that are always done in January. But the BLS plays everything totally straight, and they're doing their best to use new information as it comes in. But you shouldn't overinterpret any particular month, but on its face, this is a really strong set of estimates for workers, showing a lot of positive, demand for labor growing. It's like 5 million jobs added last year, 7.1 million added the year before, in 2020 into January 2022. Those numbers are like, the biggest number in the recovery out of the Great Recession was about 3 million. So, we're seeing very rapid recovery. We're out of the pandemic recession. We're sort of back above where we were in terms of jobs, and this is a very strong report. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So, and let me also add one other fact that I didn't mention. In addition to the 517,000 jobs that BLS counted for January, BLS revised up the job creation numbers for November and December by a total of 71,000. So that's even more jobs that we're seeing in the economy. We're joined by my friend and former Labor Department colleague, Bill Spriggs, who is a professor of economics, former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University. And from our perspective, very important, he's the chief economist of the AFL-CIO. Bill, good morning. And let me start you right off with our first question, which is, I'm sure you've looked at the report. Huge job numbers, decline in unemployment. Is this a good report for workers, bad report for workers, or is it a mixed bag?
No, it's a very good report for workers in several dimensions. The BLS makes a comparison between comparable definitions of employment for the household survey to the payroll survey. And the household survey this month was even stronger than the payroll survey, which adds some strength to the notion that this big number is probably real. Those numbers don't have to move in consort, and often if they don't, it means there's some sort of inflection point, or there are reasons why the two series don't align. The numbers show this sort of mixed result that we get, which is why I'm always angry at the Fed, that labor force participation for Black workers picked up. It picked up for Hispanic women. And if, these job opening numbers compared to unemployed workers really was a real thing, then we wouldn't get these anomalies. So for Black men, the unemployment rate went up, not for bad reasons, but for good reasons. So Black men increased their labor force participation. They just weren't overly successful at landing jobs. So the result was the employment to population ratio, the share of Black men holding a job, went up. Good news. But because so many returned to the labor market, more of them were unsuccessful. And so the unemployment rate went up. This was also true for Hispanic women. So when you look at groups that face these frictions of discrimination in the labor market, and you see them entering the labor market, and you see employers go, then that means they're still not desperate, and these job openings to unemployed workers doesn't mean what the Fed thinks it means in terms of scarcity of workers. Those numbers aren't possible. They're not consistent with that story. So, yeah, I mean, these numbers say that the declines that we saw in the growth rate of jobs, maybe that was a pause on the part of employers. Maybe they were taking their breath. Maybe they realize that the workers they're going to see don't look like the workers that they want to hire. So I think it's good news for workers. The wage growth year over year, again, I think is misleading. The big growth year over year are for workers in leisure and hospitality. All of this is increases in the minimum wage. And again, we had several states this past election cycle that raised their state minimum wage. And we still have a few states that have to finish getting to their target minimum wage increase. When you look month over month, or you look over the last 3 months, wage increases are still moderated. So I think it's really good news for workers that we added this many jobs, and that, as Alicia pointed out, we continue to narrow the gap in Black to white unemployment, which is another good thing that comes out of letting the labor market be at full employment. And again, as Aaron said, we're pretty much back to the job level of before, but it's not a lot of low-wage jobs. We're gaining in manufacturing and construction. This is good news for workers.
Absolutely. All right, Aaron, let me let you go where Bill just went, which is let's beneath the headlines. What are the numbers that you're focusing on below these, let's be honest, shocking, eye-catching headline numbers? What are the numbers below that level that you're in the details that you're digging in on?
Yeah, so mention a couple. So one thing is, the average hourly earnings growth seems to have decelerated, which is a little surprising in the context of job growth, and but is consistent with sort of what we've been seeing lately. So we see this break in the trend a little bit in terms of accelerating employment growth, but the deceleration of wage growth seems to continue. That's on its face not great news for workers. Workers like wage growth. It's good for them, for their budgets. In the way that Bill alluded to, like, it's sort of at a higher order strategic sense, maybe better for workers because it makes Fed cooling the economy, trying to pull down wage growth and cool the economy less likely. There's tons of room for wages to grow because corporate profit margins have been extremely elevated during the pandemic, and there's a lot of value that workers and companies are creating together. And right now, a lot of it's been going to the owners of the companies. Labor share of the economy has actually been falling, even while we talk about all the worker power. So there's still a lot of room for workers to make gains. So that's one. Another one is that something that didn't happen, which I was worried about, which is that there wasn't a big surge in absences during January. January 2022, a year ago.
When you say absences, you mean people who are out sick from work? Yeah,
sorry. So people who are missed an entire week of work because of childcare problems, health problems, or family obligations. A year ago, that spiked tremendously, coincident with a big Omicron wave, and put a lot of disruption into organizations, put a lot of crimp in supply and upward pressure on prices. And that didn't happen this month. And that's great news for the economy, for families, for all of us. Last thing is that temporary health services, which is kind of the most flexible piece of the labor market, and often falls in advance of recessions. It had been falling the last few months, which had me nervous and other people nervous, but it actually went up this month. So that's also good news in terms of not seeing a recession, recessionary pressures.
Yeah, I think that is an important part of the story, and it's consistent with Bill's labor demand story that we're not we're just not seeing employers dramatically driving down the number of part-time workers who want to work full-time. For example, that's been very steady. We're not seeing hours going through the roof. So this story that's being told about, oh my goodness, I can't find any workers. There's no workers anywhere. I can't hire. I keep throwing money on the stoop and nobody will pick it up. That story is just not consistent with what we're seeing in these data. These data are telling a very, very different story of a very healthy economy with opportunities for workers to get jobs, to move into good quality jobs. But it's just not a story about desperation in employer ranks to find additional workers. Alicia, what are you looking at below the high headline numbers? What are you seeing? And you play a huge role in workforce development. You work with a lot of state and local governments. How does this fit with what you're hearing from them about workforce training?
Yeah, exactly. So some of the organizations that I work with, we've been having conversations as of late where they're asking, where are my clients? Where are the workers that I'm used to seeing come in the door for training? And my response to them has been, they're working. They're able to get employment, and they're also able to move up into higher quality jobs. And so there's a mindset in workforce development about, can we go and meet those workers where they are right now to provide them with the supports that they need to stay in those jobs long term, right? I think there's still a little bit of a concern, that once we do see some softening in the labor market, those are the workers who are last in and first out. And so how can you provide some supports for those individuals to be able to maintain their jobs, maintain some progression in terms of wage growth? I think, what Aaron was saying in terms of the temp help numbers staying strong or even reversing from their recent declines is good, but we did see part-time for economic reasons rising, right? So it looks like employers are being a little bit thoughtful, if you will, or hesitant about, taking on new workers full-time, making the full-time commitment compared to where they were a few months ago. So I do know another thing that's been increasing has been who's coming into the office. So I think we're about back to 50% office occupancy in large cities. And a lot of what is driving that, people are speculating, is people concerned about, am I going to be laid off, or how do I make sure that I, keep my career going? I better be in the office showing my face. I think one thing that I agree with Aaron on too is just that it's really nice to see a decoupling of COVID surging and illnesses from the labor market. So I've been charting since the beginning of this surges in COVID with drops in female labor force participation. And it was moving one for one. Every time we saw a wave, we saw women have to exit the labor market because they were taking care of their families, they were taking care of children, there was no daycare available. And we're seeing that decoupling, which is nice. It's a return to a normalcy of what happens when people get sick. So it's nice to see that happening. And then, the last thing on job quality that we can talk a little bit more about later even is just, how do we preserve the gains that we've seen for workers? But I'll stop there now and let Bill weigh in on maybe what he sees under the numbers.
Yeah, Bill. So let me let me ask you a question first, Alicia, and I want to get Bill on this, but this issue of how do we sustain the growth, the benefits that workers have derived from these very, very, very tight labor markets. Before we turned the cameras on, you and I were talking about the number of people quitting their jobs every month. 4 million American workers are quitting their jobs every month, and that's been true for at least a year and a half, perhaps longer. So we have very large numbers of workers who are moving out of low quality, low wage jobs into higher quality, higher wage jobs. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing wages increase in the economy. Individual workers don't have the power to bargain and raise their wages. Right. If they have a union, they have a shot at it. Unions have been doing very well in these tight labor markets with their collective bargaining. But with all of that churn, and sort of you and I were talking about whether or not we've sort of reached a steady state of churning in the economy, what does that mean for workers who need to acquire new skills, need to acquire new opportunities, and want to continue moving up the career ladder?
Yeah, churn's a healthy thing for a labor economy, a labor market, and for workers, right? So being able to move from one job to another is often how you do acquire new skills. It's how you move up, right? It's how you negotiate a higher wage. It's how you seek a better opportunity, a more stable work environment. So a healthy amount of churn is great. And you're right, like we're seeing, the amount of churn leveling off. So like, job leavers is now steadying around 2.7% or something like that, but that's historically very high. And that is providing some worker power for those workers who are not in a union, right? So we're seeing workers strike, particularly in education, right? Teachers are pretty burnt out. They're asking for the wage increases they need after having gone through several years of, being on the front lines in education. But across the rest of the economy, we don't have organizations that can bargain on behalf of workers. And we have seen those jobs particularly increasing in terms of wage increases. Scheduling is another big job quality issue in those kind of hospitality types of jobs. And you can even see it, when you are out and about in terms of, what are the hours where places are open. They're giving time off for their workers during holidays, or they're making sure that they have stable schedules, and instead of this sort of flexible scheduling that we used to have before the pandemic. So that has all really contributed, you're exactly right, to improving the job quality and letting workers get into that better position that they could be in.
Yeah, Bill, so we use the magic words, worker power. You spend a lot of your time over at the AFL-CIO talking with the senior leadership there about worker power and what these numbers mean for workers and worker power and unions in particular. So I want to give you the open-ended question about what did you see below the headlines? What other numbers? You talked about some of the numbers that you focused on below the headlines that are important stories, but what do you think these numbers mean for worker power in our country?
Sorry, you brought up what unions are able to negotiate. This hasn't changed the way that people think, as we've seen with the need for workers to still strike. I mean, it's not like employers are rolling over and saying, "Oh, this is a really tough labor market," which is another one of those indications that employers don't think that this is so tight that they continue to bargain really hard. And so I think the worker power story is really more about workers feeling that they can fulfill their dream of organizing, and we see organizing campaigns being stronger than they had been. So that's good news. But when you look at the wages for new contracts, they're modest, 4%, maybe 5% wage increases on an annual basis, not much more than that. Not in response to inflation, as the Fed fears that there's some sort of built-in ratcheting that will take place. Now, of course, we have the upcoming negotiations for the UAW, where we still have a two-tiered labor market in which workers who gave massive concessions during the Great Recession that you and I both remember too well, and so they will want to continue to return to 2008 single level contracts. But in terms of the numbers, I always look at the labor force flow numbers, and this is the argument that we don't really know a good measure for labor force participation. It's continuing to be the case that those not in the labor market are overwhelmingly, when they come into the labor market, landing jobs compared to being unemployed. And so, it stretches credulity to say, so you just landed a job out of nothing. You weren't really paying attention. You weren't really looking for anything. I think it's clear that a lot of people who are measured as not in the labor force probably have a marginal attachment to the labor force that we're just not getting at. And that success rate is good news, because it means that, unlike what the Fed thinks, there's lots of room for the labor market to continue to grow, and that it's probably not as tight as we may think. The response for many workers to holding multiple jobs as a way to get higher income, we see women being far more successful as they add additional jobs. This isn't good news necessarily for workers, because it means that the wages aren't rising as much as they'd like, and they're trying to solve it with more hours. I'm a little disturbed that the long-term unemployed went up. These are workers who are very heterogeneous. This is not a story about low-skilled workers. Long-term unemployed are people who face all of these frictions that we don't have a good way of measuring, because the long-term unemployed are so heterogeneous. But them going up means that they're still having a hard time with employers. And again, this is not a sign of employers starved for workers. Often these are older workers. I mean, one clump of the long-term unemployed tend to be workers in their 50s or 40s. And the fact that employers don't want seasoned employees, and they feel that they can continue to say, I don't want you, you've been out too long, is another sign that they're not as desperate as they claim in the headlines.
Yeah.
The other thing is a ton of money is sitting with state and local governments that still hasn't been spent, that is mysterious to all of us, why state and local government employment hasn't recovered anywhere near where it had been. But we're finally seeing in this report a pickup in state and local government employment, which is a good thing. And, you know, part of it is, as I've talked to folks, is that so many of the states went to contracting this work. And so they're not showing up as public employees, they're showing up in the private sector. That isn't necessarily good. And we know that they can't be going to the private sector for teachers, that the failure to return to previous levels for local public education is still disturbing. And as Alicia was saying, with this money, the point was to reassure them and to give them the room to raise wages for teachers so that they could recruit them. And this hesitancy on the part of state and local governments to use their surpluses to address this has been a big concern.
Yeah, and not just their surpluses from their own tax revenues, but the federal government shoveled billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars to state and local governments from the American Rescue Plan. And some of that money is still sitting in state and local coffers and is not yet being spent. And some of it could very well be spent on some of the workforce development that Alicia was talking about. Okay, we have I'm sorry, go ahead, Alicia, but quickly, because we're running short on time. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. I was just going to jump in really quick and say, yeah, that unspent money, you know, some of it is sitting and waiting to be implemented. So it's been farmed out to where it needs to go. So we might see some benefits from that coming down the pike. But, you know, in particular in the childcare industry, where some states have been looking to use that money wisely to increase wages in the childcare industry, which would benefit all of us. There's been this real hesitancy to say, well, you know, we don't know what the long-term viability is of raising wages in that sector. And that's really, I think, been holding back improvements in these key areas.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. So I wanted to ask all of you Where do you think we're headed next? But I think folks are going to have to tune in next month when we have this same conversation, perhaps with this same panel. I certainly hope so. But we have to bring it to a close. Right? As always happens on these podcasts, the panelists are so smart and have so much to say. We run out of time. So we ran out of time again, but hopefully we'll be able to get all of you back on here to talk about not just labor markets, but some of the other issues that you're engaged in. So I want to thank today's guests, Alicia Modestino, Aaron Sojourner, Bill Spriggs, for their remarkable expertise and the contributions that they made to this conversation. I want to thank Lexi Anderson, who did double duty as producer and technical producer today. She's also running our social media. She does everything for us. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in. While you are here on the Power at Work blog, subscribe, hit the subscribe button, and we will be able to keep you informed of great events like this one and other content that we're producing on the Power at Work blog. Also, if you subscribe, we will send you the weekly download, which is a collection of a couple of dozen articles that we found about worker power, workers, and unions that we think that you should see. We're distributing the next issue number 2 of the weekly download today. So for those of you who subscribed, you're going to get it. Watch your inbox. But if you haven't subscribed yet, get the weekly download by subscribing here on the Power at Work blog. Thank you so much again to our guests, to our viewers. Really enjoyed seeing all of you. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.